Well, he's been under a lot of pressure. I'm surprised there hasn't been more of this sort of thing as we approach blastoff.
What are you talking about?
Buck fever, my boy. I'm afraid you're grounded.
But you can't negate what I saw.
Come on now. I'm sure Dr. Van Ponder...
But I saw it with my own eyes in the flame of that torch. And he didn't even feel it.
John!
There's something about you. You're not human.
John, stop it!
All right, I'll go. But I know what I saw.
Perhaps you see too much, John.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia. October 4th, 1957. UTC, 19 hours, 28 minutes, 34 seconds. From a spaceport in the Kazakh steppe, the Soviet Union successfully launched a modified R-7 rocket into orbit. Released from inside was a sphere of polished metal 58 centimeters in diameter and weighing 83.6 kilograms. Protruding quarter-symmetrically from one of its hemispheres were 4 antennae, which transmitted 2 steady frequencies back to Earth for the benefit of its creators, or anyone who would happen to be listening, which, in the early midst of the Cold War, was everyone. The name of this artificial satellite was Sputnik 1, and with the reception and broadcast of its little chirps maintained steadily for 21 days, its batteries dying on October 26th, the world, and the United States in particular, had proof that the worst suspicions about the knowledge gap between the globe's two great, ideologically opposed superpowers were well-founded. The nation was summarily gripped with the hysteria of being bested by the Reds, and found severely lagging behind in the Cold War. The launch of Sputnik 1 rates pretty highly in the legend of American Cold War history, and not for no reason. It was instrumental in stirring the United States from its complacency with regards to space exploration, leading directly to the creation of NASA just a year later. It also, in a broader sense, influenced greater public and private investment in science education as not merely an enlightening project, but rather one that was deeply tied to a newly minted patriotic tradition of innovation and so-called world-leading. Having been bested out of the gate by the Russians for mastery of the stars, it was all but inevitable that the Americans would spend the better part of the next decade trying to lap their great hegemonic nemesis as many times as they could, culminating in Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin successfully walking across the surface of the moon, cementing NASA as America's defining prestige political project of the 20th century. Or any century, really. And I say these things were all but inevitable, but in a sense they were inevitable. Chronicles of the Cold War space race tend to place a significant emphasis on Sputnik 1 as a signal crisis, not just to the United States political, military, and scientific establishment, but to the American public broadly. In this historical viewpoint, the acceleration by a democratically controlled, though broadly bipartisan Congress in the creation of an independent agency for space exploration and research was symbiotic with a broader groundswell of popular anxiety and downright panic in the streets. And this legend of Sputnik 1 as more or less the inciting event in a real-life Cold War science fiction movie has only tended to grow in its simplicity and hyperbolic portrayal. It is thoroughly taken for granted that there really was an American public, so to speak, that was thoroughly enmeshed in the psychic terror of the Cold War and the dastardly Russians, and the mere transcription of the legend itself has only given itself over to more hyperbole. In the 1970s, the effect of Sputnik 1 on the American collective conscious was being compared to Pearl Harbor. Just in researching this episode, I have seen YouTube videos in which an interviewed historian has compared it to September 11th. The legend of Sputnik 1 in America becomes like the legend of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, though with even less historical verification, and its characterization of the American public in effect becomes so hyperbolic in some instances that it even compels us to imagine, for the sake of entertainment, your average post-war American treating the orbit of a foreign satellite as if the very machine itself had landed in Los Angeles and laid waste like the giant robot Kronos. Incidentally, Kronos, a Robert L. Lippert production produced for 20th Century Fox, was released in April of the same year. Life imitates art, imitates life, I guess, though in this case the final art is the art of historical meta-narrative, a tendency to not merely report on events, but to contextualize those events in a symbolic order fundamentally determined by abstract emotions experienced on a collective phantom level rather than by conflicts of material interest that are indeed overdetermined in their outcome by their proximity to the levers of wealth, power, and knowledge. To be sure, there were probably lots of people who saw Sputnik 1 as the harbinger of a complacent nation's doom at the hands of global communism, but there were also lots of amateur radio enthusiasts eagerly responding to W1AW's call for monitoring data while the American mini-track system was recalibrated to the high-frequency spectrum that Sputnik was sending out its radio signals from, but they were not calibrated to interpret or pick up. Inasmuch as there may have been widespread fear, there was also inevitably widespread scientific interest, as well as widespread apathy. Well into the 70s, nonfiction books documenting Sputnik in part or in full tended to run with the narrative that the American reaction to the launch was shock and outcry, with a particular emphasis on the uncritical public's conflation of the space race with the arms race, the significance of Sputnik being viewed in a context where space exploration research was conducted by both superpowers through military channels, and where, thus, the first successful launching of an artificial satellite was seen as contiguous with the development of spying technology and intercontinental ballistics for delivering nuclear payloads. Any prevalent anxiety and hysteria was also, no doubt, exacerbated by other contextual factors, such as the economic downturn of 1957, as well as heightening tensions in the wake of school desegregation efforts and the burgeoning civil rights movement. But if anything encouraged any type of mass anxiety or hysteria with regards to Sputnik, even contemporary observers, such as New York Times writer Richard Witkin, laid blame squarely at the feet of the American popular press. Expanded upon further by Walter A. McDougall in his 1985 book The Heavens and the Earth, A Political History of the Space Race, as well as Jack Lule in a 1991 survey of major newspaper coverage of Sputnik published in the Journalism Quarterly. Newspapers, from regular columnists to editorial boards, became, quote, managers of the symbolic arena, structuring and shaping public discussion about Sputnik. At a time when there was not yet overnight polling technology to gauge public perception, the American press spearheaded a narrative in which the primary takeaway from Sputnik was that it was primarily a triumph of propaganda and prestige for the Soviet Union, rather than for global science, and that the natural reaction from the American public in this sense should be a mixture of fear and failure. Jack Lule outlined three primary narratives of this media riot, as Witkin called it. The first emphasized the United States' symbolic defeat at the hands of the Soviets. From the Los Angeles Times, for instance, subhead, Victory for Russia, extract, the Soviet Union claimed a victory over the United States. The New York Times similarly emphasized that Russia had, quote, put a scientific instrument into space before the United States. Obviously, Russia doing it before the United States is not a matter of public record. The Soviet Union did it before anybody did it. The United States shouldn't be considered special in that regard. It's not a matter of public record. What's the matter of public record is that Russia did it, not that they did it before the U.S. From the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Washington sees feat as Cold War setback. Russia had beaten the United States in the satellite race. Again, the satellite race is not a matter of record. It's just, I mean, I guess that you could interpret that as a matter of record. But again, you see where the drama is playing out here. The second narrative, or drama, as Lule terms it, was played on the level of the Soviets apparently usurping the United States' international prestige through Sputnik. Reports and editorials suggested that the failure was fundamentally one of American complacency and self-satisfaction. As Walter Lippmann put it in a column for the Post-Dispatch, Americans had come to treat their post-war prosperity as a narcotic. Quote, our people have been led to believe in the enormous fallacy that the highest purpose of the American social order is to multiply the enjoyment of consumer goods. In the face of this global mortification, increased investment in science education and incentives for scientific research were seen as a sure way to close the yawning knowledge gap between the US and the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, as an aside, the press furor over Sputnik served to focus a pre-extant offensive against progressive or alternative theories of education, but, that's for another day. The third and final drama occurred on the level of editorials at once extolling the mythological dimensions of the Sputnik success, a feat that carried a certain inherent value as a source of scientific knowledge for all mankind, while on the other hand instilling fear in the reader of the potential of this technological power in the wrong hands, being used, as the New York Times editorial suggested, quote, for the purposes of aggression, death, and destruction. In other words, the conflation of the power-focused arms race and the prestige-focused space race was not at all a popular anomaly. It was a narrative directly influenced by the mainstream media and its representation of expert testimony, whether from politicians, scientists, or on the part of the journalists themselves editorializing their coverage. Inevitably, any apparent anxiety or hysteria regarding Sputnik intersected with broader social movements, political machinations, and various forms of advocacy that, in and of themselves, had far more to do with actually getting the U.S. out from under the shadow of Sputnik than the hysteria did. In the case of politics, Sputnik and perceived complacency of the Republican Eisenhower administration in response to it presented a convenient wedge issue for Democrats seeking to maintain their control of Congress and, in the run-up to the 1960 presidential election, a way to portray their opposition as both too anti-intellectual as well as too soft on the threat of global communism. Scientists also had an incentive in this context to push the anxiety line as an agenda because it could potentially be used to leverage greater investment in scientific research broadly and space exploration specifically, and more important, outside of the limiting context of military development, space exploration as an independent agency rather than a subsidiary of military tech. But even acknowledging this only really scratches the surface of just how disassociated much of what was occurring in the sphere of journalism, politics, and science actually had to do with what the so-called American public felt. At very best, there was a certain degree of polarization among Americans broadly about whether the successful launch of Sputnik was significant, and in a way that should be a cause for concern for Americans or not. But as Kim McQuaid outlines in a 2007 essay published in the Canadian Review of American Studies, contemporary evidence in the form of polling and surveys tends to reveal that, quote, the symbiosis between space races and arms races was more of an elite than a mass phenomenon. Whereas MIT president and first cabinet-level presidential science advisor Dr. James T. Killian Jr., appointed in November 1957, could attest in his 1977 memoir that Sputnik, quote, created a crisis of confidence that swept the country like a wind-blown forest fire, political analyst Samuel Lule, working actually in 1957 and 58, found to his surprise and dismay that, quote, no evidence at all of any panic or hysteria in the public's reaction, and published those findings as early as a 1958 edition of the Columbia Review. A Gallup poll conducted only a week after Sputnik 1 launched also reported little panic, and again, at best, a polarization in public reckoning on the subject. Half were surprised Russia had launched an artificial satellite first, half were not. Half felt this was a serious blow to U.S. prestige, half did not. Nonetheless, far from a crisis of confidence, a full 60% of those polled felt that the next advancement in space exploration or science generally would come from the Americans, suggesting that among the majority of the so-called public, there was no prevalent feeling that the U.S. was lagging behind or set back by Sputnik. Where things get hairier is the question of, even supposing that America is lagging behind the Russians in space exploration, what precisely to do about it? Shockingly, another Gallup poll, a week later, found that half of respondents believed that Russia was moving ahead of the U.S. in long-distance rocketry, but nonetheless found no correlation between those figures and a significant wave of support for space exploration. The conflation of the prestige-based space race with the anxiety-inducing, power-focused arms race remained a subject of insular concern more often represented by people of wealth and advanced education. This was, after all, a period in which only 10% of American males and 6% of American females were college graduates, and fewer than half over the age of 25 had even finished high school. And despite hectoring from the Democratic side about Ike's and the Republican Party's feet-dragging, the administration's confidence that Sputnik was a propaganda defeat, but had no military significance, bolstered by their commitment to secrecy, not letting the American public know how much they knew about either Soviet space or arms developments, or thusly our own infrastructure for gathering such information. This was in turn just as likely to inspire reciprocal confidence in the public. Lebel's study especially revealed that his sampling tended to look to the president, not to journalists, eggheads, or congressmen, for where to place their confidence. To wit, most of their concern remained with the threat of intercontinental ballistics and nuclear weapons, and thus the advancement of the U.S. military in keeping up with these technologies, as well as far-reaching spy infrastructure to keep tabs on the Ruskies. The line conflating a tougher posturing towards Russia with expansion of space exploration didn't scan as well, perhaps because it was indeed a strategic partnership rather than an organic or contiguous one. Moreover, the same contextual factors alluded to by Lule that may have contributed to increased public anxiety about the space race just as likely contributed to less concern about what the Russians were doing with satellites. Again, in the midst of a recession, economically anxious Americans and Democrats, even when concerned about Russia's advancements in space exploration and the apparent failures of the Republican presidency and administration, they thought with their pocketbooks. Hence, a 1958 study by the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan found that Sputnik and its coverage had greatly expanded public awareness of space as a scientific frontier, but also found no strong public support for space projects such as manned interplanetary flight or lunar landing. The vast majority of respondents would prefer such funding, if it were available for an alternative, to be directed towards medical research and other more parochial programs. Such findings would come as no surprise to Donald N. Michael, a Harvard social psychologist with a background in the national sciences, who would eventually go on to co-author the NASA-commissioned Brookings Report on the implications of peaceful space activities to human affairs. Michael's mixture of disciplines made him uniquely predisposed to understanding the fundamental schism between the response of the mainstream media, scientists, and national leaders to a significant event and, quote, the intensity, direction, and duration of interest in the public. From the perspective of social psychology, Michael argued that public opinion was inherently pluralistic. The public itself, in quotes, was a phantom construct that often stood in for the insular goals of those of a certain level of wealth, education, and influence. There was no good reason to believe in strong public pressure for space exploration, quote, unless very special efforts are made to elicit it. The problem with meta-narratives, which we have previously encountered on this podcast when analyzing The Day the Earth Stood Still, is that they often tend to focus precisely on these deliberate efforts historically to elicit broad public emotions and responses without doing the work to understand the plurality of social consciousness. And this is a problem that especially occurs on the level of discourse about popular cinema, as we are discussing a topic that, in one sense, seems so expressly tethered to catering to the broadest possible characterization of a particular moment and the people experiencing it, but through a means in which it is just that once more removed from the actual facts on the ground, as it were. And in a way, it is precisely the inherent illusion of cinema, a document of discreetly staged events from the past, stitched together in such a way as to immerse us in their presence and continuity. It is precisely the inherent illusion of cinema that makes it so difficult to disaggregate them from the larger contextual illusion of history as a dramatic narrative, one that we are unconsciously participating in crafting in order to make it more persuasive and compelling. Just on this podcast, there has been many times in which I attempted to engage my father on the level of certain films expressing anxieties of the Cold War moment in which he grew up, and yet me being disappointed to realize that any such pretense of these works being expressive of a collective unconscious bound up in the Cold War experience is just as alien to him as it is to me. He can understand them in terms of historical themes when pressed about it, but like those very Americans polled and surveyed by Lule and Gallup, his actual frame of reference is parochial. These movies, after all, are just movies. Even so, just like mainstream journalists, advocates for scientific research, and national political leaders, and perhaps even more so than all of these combined, filmmakers are managers of the symbolic arena. In the absence of a true phantom collective consciousness rooted into a unifying historical moment and experience, films are special efforts to elicit a particular response, transactional as well as emotional, that ultimately works to create a phantom public presupposed and manufactured by the commercial film industry. Nobody has actually experienced a Cold War experience, but films convince us that such an experience did happen or exist. And even at our most oppositional to the film as reactionary commodity itself, we often fail to acknowledge or even realize that basic fantasy premise. Film discourse as it is currently constituted frequently treats discrete works, at least when the reader finds them interesting enough, as uniquely expressive of a historical moment, rather than as what they are, which are the insular products of individuals with narrow motivations and who, to the extent that they relate to a society, do so under equally narrow transactional circumstances or are overdetermined by transactional circumstances rather than through bonds of experience. Within this framework, then, it may be possible to not only emancipate ourselves more fully from the propaganda of commercial cinema, but to also, in a strange way, appreciate discrete works situated within and specifically capitalizing on a unique historical moment, and in such a way that productively foregrounds their particularity, their perverse oddity, their insular dissociation from the moment or zeitgeist.